Welcome to the Green Lectionary podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, and today we'll be looking at a text for the fourth week of Advent from the Revised Common Lectionary. For this episode, I am joined by three guests: Dr. Brent Strawn, Professor of Old Testament at Duke Divinity School, Dr. Melissa Jackson, faculty member of Sophia Seminary, and Joelle Novey, Director of DMV Interfaith Power and Light. Before we jump into our show, I just want to give a quick plug for one of Creation Justice Ministries' other programs, Blue Theology. Blue Theology is a place where current science and marine biology meets a theology of creation justice. Each summer, we host youth groups to engage in experiential learning, service projects, and contemplative practice with God's marine creation. We have several locations across the country, and registration is open now. To learn more, go to www.bluetheology.com. Okay, our passage for today comes from Psalm 89, verses 1 to 4 and 19 to 26. I will sing of your steadfast love, O Lord, forever. With my mouth I will proclaim your faithfulness to all generations. I declare that your steadfast love is established forever. Your faithfulness is as firm as the heavens. And you said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to my servant David. I will establish your descendants forever and build your throne for all generations. Then skipping down to verse 19. Then you spoke in a vision to your faithful one and said, I have set the crown on one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found my servant David. With my holy oil I have anointed him. My hand shall always remain with him. My arm also shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him. The wicked shall not humble him. I will crush his foes before him and strike down those who hate him. My faithfulness and steadfast love shall be with him, and in my name his horn shall be exalted. I will set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. He shall cry to me, You are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. So, friends, where is creation in this passage? And Brent, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Derek. It's good to be with you all, and nice to be on the podcast. Psalm 89 is a long one. We only get a little bit of it in the lectionary reading, and that's always a bit unfortunate when the lectionary slices and dices for us, because there's all kinds of stuff in here that the psalmist wanted us to have, because it's a whole big long psalm. In fact, it's a really important one that I'm sure we'll get into as we go. It's 52 verses in its full extent and closes down book 3 of the Psalter, and has an important structural role to play in the book of Psalms. But if we just at least begin with the verses that are on the docket for this particular reading, this particular Sunday, right out of the gate, it strikes me that verse 2 mentions the heavens, and that God's faithfulness is compared in its security, or firmness is the word in the New Revised Standard Version here, as the heavens. And so, right out of the gate, something about God is compared to something that we can see in the created order, and that's intriguing. The heavens is a large category, the skies or whatever, in the ancient Near Eastern conception. Maybe that's not just what you can see with your eyes; it's also what you can't see, where the gods live or where the divine beings reside or what have you. But that struck me in reading it this morning before the podcast, that right out of the gate, God's faithfulness is compared to a created thing. So that's the first thing I would say.
Joelle, you want to jump in?
Yes, like Brent, I very much focused on this assurance in the opening lines that we can be confident into future generations for eternity of God's steadfastness and faithfulness, because like the heavens, they'll always be there. And as a climate activist working with faith communities, I actually felt some poignancy and some in that kind of assurance, because I think for our ancestors, of course, the heavens would always be there. And of course, the heavens are a reminder of God's unchanging eternal commitment to God's people. But in this generation, where with the climate crisis, human beings are the driving force behind the Earth's climate for the first time ever. And and we can't feel a sense of confidence and assurance that into all the future generations the heavens will be as they always have been. It just reminded me how spiritually disorienting the reality of the climate crisis can be for folks, and that's coming from a place of losing access to that sense of absolute steadfast assurance and unchanging, that the natural world will forever be an unchanging reminder of God's unchanging faithfulness. That we really get challenged, and our theologies get challenged if we take the climate crisis seriously.
Yeah, that's really good. Melissa, you want to jump in?
Sure. The other, at least overt reference to something in creation then is in verse 25, near the end of the passage. I will set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers, which is a reference to how God will empower this chosen one to also have some role in creation, which clearly asks the question of what is humanity's role in co-caring for creation with God, and the extent to which God has empowered this leader in this text. But then I guess the next question is how we are empowered with respect to how to care for creation. And this is more of a reference to power in the traditional sense, that this is a leader who will exert power and to have power, which is a different kind of slant than to, like, if we're thinking about Genesis, when we're thinking about care and stewardship of creation. So that's always a complication in the text. And I will say, which is what's been unsaid so far, but we will all four have noticed, is that the part of this psalm that deals most directly with creation is left out of the lectionary text for this Sunday. So we don't get the full references here in what we've read, but there are others in that in between the piece that's been excised from the lectionary reading for this day.
Yeah, if I could piggyback on that, if that's all right. Melissa, you're specifically thinking, I guess, of verses 5, right, to 18, which is reminiscent of other psalm texts, particularly in my mind, Psalm 24, but others as well, Psalm 74. And here, again, you got the heavens praising the Lord's wonders. So what Joelle said about, the impact of such an image, if the, world isn't there in the same way, that leaves its mark, as it were, not just on the planet or whatever, but on theology, on the metaphors for theology, for the understanding of God, or for God's praise in the Psalms experience. I mean, if the heavens declared the glory of God and there's no more heavens, or they're not quite as glorious as they were before, then certainly God's glory is also impinged upon. But as I read it, and of course, this is the great thing about reading a text afresh with different lenses or different concerns in mind, I thought, oh yeah, there's the heavens, there's the skies, verse 5 or 6. Oh, look at verse 9. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. The heavens are yours. The earth also is yours. There's a sense in which in ancient Israelite conception, the creation is also a threatening thing, something that is scary and that has to be kept at bay, at least in its worst iterations. And that's part of the witness of the Psalms as well, and that God has the power to do that. And I think that has to be kept in mind when Melissa brings up this really great point about the king or the royal figure or whatever it is who exercises some sort of power, that power has to sort of be seen in some way as related to the divine power and in concert with it in its best iteration. Otherwise, in my mind, it doesn't make sense, or we have to sort of worry excessively about it. But in the Psalms, and I confess I'm still trying to get my head around this, the king in the Psalms is not my favorite part of the Psalms, but the king is there. And I think in the best iteration, the king is there because the king represents the best instantiation in the ideal form of the ideal Israelite who serves as God's representative in the world. But that made me think also, as I reread the Psalms, that well, where is creation in the psalm? In the king, and in the psalmist, and also in the foes that are mentioned, the enemies that are mentioned, or in the holy oil that's mentioned. I mean, it's just sort of, once you have this lens in mind and you're reading through it, it's everywhere, right? And it's everywhere in kind of nuanced ways, and in ways that we might like, and in certain ways maybe we don't like, and we have to sort of figure out, oh, well, how are the foes part of create? What does it mean that the foes are part of creation? And does that make me think differently about my foes? Or might there really be foes? All kinds of interesting things like that. But I really wanted to underscore Melissa's point that there's all kinds of stuff that's sort of left out in that key section, which is really the praise of God before the psalmist starts thinking hard about what's happened to the king, because the greatness of the king turns out, well, it hasn't been so great at the end of the psalm.
And I read Psalms, from a Jewish perspective and context, where many of them, not all, but some of them are used routinely in liturgy, right? Like the whole opening part of our prayer service is Sukkah de Zimra, which are like songs of praise, mostly just singing and reading Psalms. And in that context, these recitations of how nature praises God, the rivers rush, and the birds sing, and the waves crash, and it's always implicit in that, as Melissa raised, it's like, well, what is our role in this? What is our role in this chorus, right? And if that recitation of the natural world praising God, each in its own way, is recited by human beings who are saying these psalms, in worship, it implicitly sort of says, and our way of doing that is by singing these psalms. And it sort of, it to me, psalms often feel like a working out of this question of, that the angels sing in the heavens, and the river and the mountains clap their hands, and what do we do? Well, I guess we sing these songs, I think these psalms, or we try to sing them as in the same spirit in which those the rest of creation praises.
And don't you think, Joel, that does something to us, right? I mean, if we do that enough times, we start thinking, words of Psalm 96 and 98 are kind of what you're evoking with the rivers will clap their hands, or the trees. I mean, who knew that rivers had hands, that they could clap, but if I read it long enough and it starts getting into my bones, into my imagination, then, I can become, I think, a different person, at least in my thinking about the world, that it's sort of, the heavens are filled with the glory of God, for that matter, or to quote John Calvin, the great Protestant reformer, that the world is the theater of God's glory. I think the Psalms are, and the recitation of the Psalms, as you're saying, is a kind of a way to suddenly experience that, not just sort of think it, but kind of feel it at a profound level.
The fascinating thing for me, though, is, and like the Psalms don't speak in one voice about what our role is, right? There's different strains. So one of the inconsistencies that the Talmud, the Jewish rabbinic tradition, picks up on is that later in this same psalm, there are the lines, "The heaven is yours and the earth too, the world and all it holds," which is reminiscent of other psalms that say, the earth is the Lord's, is one of the famous ones, and the fullness thereof. But elsewhere in Psalm 115, it says, "The heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth God has given to humanity," right? So Rabbi Levi in the Talmud picks up on this inconsistency. Which one is it? Is it that the earth is the Lord's, or is it that the earth is the Lord's and the heavens are the Lord's and the earth has been given to humanity? And this is often a way the Jewish rabbinic tradition raises a potential contradiction and then resolves it as actually consistent. And the way they resolve it is to say, well, the heavens and the earth both belong to God before a blessing is recited. But after a human being acknowledges the divine source of the earth, so like you're holding an apple in your hand and it belongs to God, and then you say, blessed is the one who brings the fruit of the tree before you eat it, and if you do that, then the earth has been given to humanity, which is one. But so that just this psalm just reminded me of that sort of discourse around like where do human beings fit? The heavens, and God and the angels, are depicted a lot, and the animals and natural world are depicted, and then there's this sort of question mark about where we fit and where our voice fits, that I think gets elaborated and worked out, and has multiple possibilities expressed in the song.
Well, and Brent, you threw in a complication here, right? You mentioned that the king is part of creation, but then you also mentioned that the foes are part of creation, and that is incredibly problematic. Because I think part of, if we look at the scripture, we see these places where we are looking at creation with reverence, but also with a little bit of fear. And I think part of our issues with our theology with creation is that we have oftentimes treated creation as a foe to be conquered, a foe to be overtaken, a foe to be to submit to our will. That when we add creation to the list of foes, I think we have a really dicey way of looking at this that becomes incredibly problematic, but also seems very consistent when we think of the fact that these things that, Joelle, as you said earlier, have been, for the vast majority of human history, thought of as permanent, as unmovable, of unshakable. And we are now at a place as humanity where we can conquer it, where we can make it do what we want it to do. It's complicating. It feels like it's a complicating part of the image here.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in and really kind of echoing some things that Joel brought up already, it's like it is disconcerting to think about creation as a foe, or parts of creation as a foe, especially if we want to really develop a robust theology of creation and creation care and all that jazz. But I think it's probably also important to not skirt that idea, even if we want to ultimately contain it or transcend it in some sort of way. I mean, for one thing, it's present in the biblical witness, that and of course that makes sense to, I think, to ancient readers who would have been very much threatened by natural forces in a way that we are not if we are in our hurricane shelter or what have you, with reinforced concrete and all the rest. But even now, I think the human project expends immense amounts of energy in containing the threat that the world poses to us. I mean, technology is an excessive attempt to master our environments. Medicine, I mean, for heaven's sake. I mean, we've got to contain these bacteria or these things that come up that are part of the natural world, right? That get us eventually, all in the end, one way or the other. We're going to expend massive amounts of human energy and capital and money and creativity in the medical field to stave those things off as long as possible. And not all of that is bad, right? And that maybe not all of it is good if you think about it in this way. The excessive attempt to manipulate our environment or to contain the forces of death when they are inevitable in a patient at the very last stages of their life, for instance. Those things, though, it seems to me like those threats are still real to us, even if we don't think of them as like a thunderstorm and there's the weather god Baal behind it and he's going to zap me. But there's cancer and there's septic infections and there's things like this, and we do fight those. But then also maybe a more generous construal that even the foes are part of the created order might make us think a little differently about some of those foes. Maybe they aren't quite as threatening, or we shouldn't fight them quite as hard. I think there's ways in which the Psalter brings the foes close at times, not always, right? But one of the things the Psalter does is hand those foes over to God, I think, and that God is ultimately the one in charge of their payback. That's the cursing Psalms, I think. But there's other ways I think that the Psalms do suggest other ways of relating to the human foe. They are threatening and difficult and problematic, but there's ways that God will see to them, and that maybe that God will bring them close as well.
Well, I just wanted to just for a moment to call attention to in the Hebrew, the word can be translated fear and worship. There's a word that holds within that both. And I think when we, as humans who are in the created order, but we're not in charge of the created order, we have a particular posture towards the created order. That is, when we talk about fear of the Lord, it's not like I'm cowering in a corner because I'm afraid I'm going to be hit. It's that I have a particular posture towards whatever, usually God, that understands that I'm part of this order, but I also need to have a reverence for God. And I think if we can there is the bringing up of the enemies in this text, but also when we talk about fear in the context of the Hebrew Bible, there is scope there to talk about reverence and the fear that you feel when you're standing at the shore and you see the power of the ocean and the power of the waves. You're not afraid necessarily, but if those waves start coming towards you, that fear becomes something different. It has a different quality. So I think there's a lot to be teased out in our understanding of, what our relationship, what that fear looks like when we're talking about our relationship to God, but also our relationship to creation. That there's a reverence in that, but it can escalate to something that looks a lot more like I'm terrified now because creation is bigger and more powerful than I am. It's threatening me in that sense.
Yeah, that's really good. I want to shift to our second question, which is, how is God calling us to interact with creation through this passage? In light of some of the things that we have, in light of some of the ways that we have identified creation being present in this passage, how is God calling us to interact with it?
Yeah, especially in that second selection where it's talking about enemies and those who hate you, and that God will be your buddy in kind of prevailing over these your enemies. And I didn't imagine creation or more figurative foes. I imagine, like, other people that you think of are as less holy than you are. And I guess it mostly my reaction was that this is the kind of theology I think doesn't serve us very well in this time, and that a lot of and I believe, this comes out of the Hebrew Bible. I think it gets picked, that it has elements that Jews struggle with now, and I think it also gets picked up and gets becomes problematic too in Christian teaching. But like this idea that God will exalt you out of the other people, right? Like that you will be lifted out of the context and out of the out of the world in which we exist concretely, and like elevated away to and saved as a kind of remnant, or like kind of scurried off. I've done a lot of learning from Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer at Georgetown about the limitations of the Noah's Ark story, and the idea of sort of like, let's just save like a little remnant. God will just see to like the fact that like accept the destruction of almost everything, and just scurry away with the good people, and we can be sure that we'll be on the boat, so we don't have to worry too much about what gets left behind. And I think that I worry that to the extent that we read this particular passage as calling us to have that kind of orientation, I think it creates a competitive zero-sum world in which we have to compete with each other to be God's chosen selected on the to make the team, to make the cut. And it also imagines that our salvation will carry us out of the context of our world on earth, when we really, I think that the climate crisis calls us to deepen our sense of interdependence, to expand our sense of what's worth saving, to imagine a God who cares not just about those who God wishes to exalt, but about absolutely everyone, including the people you sometimes think of as your enemies. And so I don't know if this is too too challenging for this conversation, but my first reaction was that I struggle with this particular theology, and I don't know that it's the strain of our traditions we want to really lean on in this moment. I think it actually doesn't help us a whole lot.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Melissa, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I think this is where, the lectionary giveth and the lectionary taketh away. I don't really know if we can faithfully read this part of the psalm without reading the second part of the psalm, because we have this affirmative first half, and then we have this second half that says, but, right, which is the Hebrew Bible's position on kingship throughout. Like, we want it, we don't want it. It's a good idea, it's a bad idea. It's God's idea, it's human's idea. Like, there's this, and those passages are interwoven with each other, and there's never a final decision. And so this psalm takes that question up. Like, what is kingship for Israel? And it was, and Brent's already talked about it. It's like it's a good thing, except when it's not a good thing. So I believe here then we have permission to take up both sides of the conversation. That is this a theology in the first part of the psalm, the text that we're given for this Sunday? Is this the theology that we want to hold on to? Or do we want to choose the other? Or do we do what I think Scripture wants us to do, which is to hold those in tension, which is more complicated, but it's also more organic, and it's also more true to who we are as humans, who do the right thing sometimes and then don't. And of course, that I didn't anywhere in there say creation. So what does it mean when we interact with creation? Well, it seems, first of all, we need to make sure that hubris has not got a hold of us. And that we do think we are like David, and we do have our hands on the sea and the ocean and the rivers, that creation is ours to try and bend to our own will. But yet maintain the idea that we do have a responsibility, and it's been given to us by God in some form. And so we darn well better take that seriously. Yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Brent, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm thinking about what has been said, and I think it's very helpful and insightful and interesting to ponder this question. Particularly, it goes back to my initial comment or two about, my own pondering of the royal figure. And I think the only way I can, as I said, make sense of the royal figure is in its best possible iteration. I mean, its best possible iteration. This is the sort of benevolent monarch who takes care in the ancient Near Eastern world of widows and orphans. I mean, that's one of their primary things to do, was to take care of people who are down and out, and to promulgate law, just law, and all the rest. That's the ideal. Of course, the real never mentions the ideal. And so that's why the Bible is full of stories about these kings. Even Israel's sort of favorite king, David, right? They preserve the most horrific stories about what David did. And yet he doesn't get censored. He still is in there, and the Psalms, so much of the Psalms get sort of dedicated to him. And so it's a very curious thing. Somehow we have to think it through. And I confess I haven't done it, at least not to my own satisfaction. I know there have people who've spent a lot of ink and time on it, and think higher thoughts and better thoughts than mine on it. But I do think, in light of what's been said, a couple things might be helpful in the call to action. One might be to say, we are not the king, and the average Israelite wasn't the king. The average Israelite who may have said a psalm might have thought about the king, thought about the monarch in a highfalutin, elevated way. but they knew that they weren't that person. And so maybe we arrogate to ourselves too much when we sort of put ourselves in that position. Maybe we ought to think we're not that position at all, right? And so not think of ourselves in that royal function. I think that goes to Joelle's concern and critique. And maybe if we stop thinking of ourselves as monarchs, as rulers of creation, that we would stop acting like it, especially in the worst possible iteration of that vision. Um, but the other thing is that maybe, as Melissa said, if we read this psalm quite closely, the whole thing, the monarch who supposedly is so great that God promises all this to, God also has a big contingency clause in verse 30. If the monarch's children, forsake my law and do not walk according to my ordinances, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, I will punish them. So this is not a kind of carte blanche, do whatever you want. This is very much a ruling, This is kind of you've got to be in line with the Torah. And if you're not, your rule is going to be short and it will have an expiration date. And then what the psalm ends up doing is sort of say how, guess what? The expiration date seems to have hit because this great king is now completely bereft. The king is completely abandoned. All of God's steadfast love and promises to the king and his dynasty, all of them are in tatters. And so maybe that is another way to sort of inhabit this problem and this difficult image of the king that Joelle has raised for us is that, well, maybe if you do inhabit that, and especially you inhabit that vision wrongly, you're going to end up with nothing as well. And even if you think that you're the greatest thing since sliced bread or whatever, you may also find yourself abandoned, rejected, alone, and feeling like God has gone back on all of the promises. So I think the king is the royal figure, something to worry about, and also maybe to inhabit, not to inhabit in its kind of worst iteration, obviously, but then to possibly inhabit in its abasement here at the end of the psalm. So I'm wondering if that might bring us, if we did that, to a very humble attitude vis-a-vis our role, if we do sort of insist to read ourselves in the place of this monarch.
I'm really challenged in thinking about how we connect this to creation and our relationship to creation, because as we stated at the opening of this psalm kind of speaks to the skies as something that will be lasting and permanent. And then if we do fold in this second part of the psalm, we have the king who is exalted, who's on God's side. We have the warning that the king's children, if they screw up, not so much on God's side. Then the oops, we're not on God's side anymore, you're being punished. And then sort of the response to oops, we're not on God's side, we're being punished is, how long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. For what vanity you have created all mortals, who can live and never see death. And so the contrast of God creation being forever, being permanent, and then we mortals, even if we're the king, being transient, being subject to even death. And again, if we fold ourselves in as part of creation, recognizing that we have now recognized that those things that we thought were permanent, those things that we thought could never be moved, are now, like us, also subjected to many of the things that can cause decay and destruction and harm and pollution. It brings creation into that space of asking for mercy the way that we are asked, that the psalmist is asking for mercy. How long, O God? How long will we be subjected to these forces? again, this is really challenging, and it's a really challenging for me as a Christian. And Joelle, I'm really grateful for your being here, and I'm really grateful for your insight. I'm really challenged that we decided that this should be a part of Advent. That and not only did that we thought it should be part of Advent, that we then like cut it off at the knees and didn't give the full picture of the role of the king. So I think one of the things that we often do on this podcast is really muddy the water. And I think that's what this, I think this is asking us to struggle with some big complexities, one of which is, what is the role of dominion, domination? How far can we take that before we get to the place where we have turned our back on God and we've turned our back on God's creation? There's a lot of complicated things here. There's a lot of messy things here that are not just simply, let's be happy about a good king, which is, I think, what the lectionary folks wanted us to do. So with all that in mind, where is a call to action here? How do we, I know, now that it is clear as mud, how do we take this incredibly complicated view of creation, of what authority and domination and dominion look like? How do we take this and turn it into some sort of call to action for what it means to be faithful, faithful stewards of creation, faithful members of an ecosystem? How do we take all of this and move it forward to a call to action? Joelle, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I share your struggle with kingship as a metaphor. And in the Jewish liturgical calendar, we really lean into the king thing, like mostly in the high holidays in the fall. And we sing Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimlech Le'olam Va'ed. God is the king and will be the king forever and ever. At that time of year. And I think one of the values I've come to find in that theology is you are affirming who is the king, but you're also affirming who is not the king. Who is not the king. And during many of the generations when people said these words and affirmed over and over again that God was king, they were under various empires and regimes and folks who had power over them, who were not, who they were affirming we're not their king. And maybe today that's the corporate powers that would seek to destroy our planet. And maybe that's, the industrial polluters that have prevailed in destroying the one and only world we have, and not been held accountable largely for generations. And I think and we can be reminded by this imagery that affirms God's kingship over the natural world, also about the limitations of our own role. So, if we are affirming that God should set the clock of the seasons and should bring forth the tides and whatnot, then like our through industrial pollution, like unmooring those systems and becoming it's really inappropriate to step into that role when these psalms affirm that is God's role. The one other place I feel like this kind of affirming God's kingship and God's dominion on the earth can be valuable is about kind of challenging capitalism a little bit. And like when we say the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, or the text in this psalm is the heaven is yours and the earth too, the world and all it holds. I mean, that has to put a little asterisk at least next to the way we operate, which is that each of us think of ourselves as being able to own land. I mean, own parts of the land that we that we are on, and many of us as settlers on that land, right? So I guess I hope that we can find a call to action even in these texts that kind of affirm God's kingship and God's dominion in a very classical way by sort of using it to contrast with, well, who is not king and who is not does not have dominion over the earth, and maybe that can be a good lesson for us.
Melissa?
I would add another thing is that anytime we're in the Psalms, we are in a worship context. So if we think of worship as an act of the gathered people, then one of the calls to action would be to invite this conversation, but also this rehearsing of the acts of God into our worship, and allow that our worship can be a time to grapple with the complexities, that it doesn't have to be something sort of clean and clear, that praise doesn't have to be devoid of question, or that to accept one viewpoint is to reject another, that we can hold viewpoints together and allow that complexity to be part of how we are as a gathered people in worship. And then if we think of kind of, for Christians at least, the final act of worship is descending forth, that then we carry that posture into the world, and that we are in creation as complex beings, that we don't place ourselves in a hierarchy that puts us above that creation in any way. I think that's another piece that's action, is the worship nature of the Psalms, and how it calls us to bring that complexity into our worship life as a community.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Brent?
Yeah, I think Joel and Melissa have already hit the best things. I'll just reiterate a couple of points. One is, I think Melissa's point about holding things in tension is very useful. I think it's also something that is difficult to do sometimes for long, or at least it's hard to do when we need to do something that's action based. We're going to have to choose one of these options. And so I think we can think about the tensiveness or the multiple range of options that Scripture gives us on any sort of topic as we can think about that prudentially as well as theoretically, not just that these are kind of held together or offered as options, but maybe prudentially they give us options that we should ponder in the particular moment at hand. And so, as has already been said, the moment at hand suggests that human beings should probably not think of themselves in royal categories, and never in the negative sense of that metaphor. But in the positive sense, perhaps so. Invasive species, I mean, kudzu, and these were things that are overtaking the South. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to bring some goats in to beat some of that back before all of Georgia is taking over. That would be a kind of benevolent, control, as it were, bringing the goats in to beat the kudzu back or something. So again, I think some of these things can be viewed in negative or positive lights. We want to obviously hit the positive ones, and that's the hard thing, because as human beings, we tend toward the negative. But I think that tensiveness helps us maybe think about prudential options and what the best case is what's called for in this particular case. The other thing I wanted to pick up on from Joelle is I think that's exactly right, that to affirm the king or God's kingship, or in the Christian calendar with Advent, to affirm the kingship of Christ is to affirm that we are not that person, but subject to that person and subject to what that person would want us to do. Even David, again, I think with the Israelites look to David as this example. And David, though, had his problems, and they're preserved for us. We don't sanctify. Well, the chronicler kind of sanctifies, David kind of washes him of all his Bathsheba and Uriah issues. But Kings doesn't, and Samuel doesn't. And at that point, one of the things that stands out about David is how quick he is when confronted by Nathan to confess his sin. maybe that is one of the reasons why Israel valorizes David, not just because he's good on the harp or he can, compose some rhymes, but because he's quick to confess. And so maybe there is even in the king motif a place for us to think even the king has to confess. And look at what happens in Psalm 89, right? Psalm 89, the king is ultimately abased, and in light of the conditional clause in the psalm, it really has to be considered that the king is abased because disobedience has happened. I mean, this is a psalm that seems to know of the destruction of Jerusalem and all the rest. So the abasement of the psalm in my mind, so of course, the first part of the psalm is in Advent because this is about the kingship of Christ. But the second part of the psalm, the abasement, that should be in the Passion Week. I mean, that should be in the lectionary for Passion. It's not, I don't think. I tried to search real
I
quickly.
don't think so.
But the ending of the psalm too, I think, is really important to think about, because maybe if we inhabit the full psalm, we say, we have made mistakes in the royal roll, maybe by arrogating ourselves to it. And now all is lost. And as you said so well, Derek, where is God now? How long? Now we're confronted with our mortality, the mortality and limitations of our whole ecosphere. What then? Lord, remember, this lament. And then just this little hint of hope at the end with "Blessed be the Lord forever, amen and amen." That's just the doxology. It's the concluding doxology of Book 3, but it's there, it's present in Psalm 89. And it suggests that after everything is lost, there may yet still be hope in the blessings of the Lord, and that the Lord deserves blessings, even despite this ending. And right after Book 3 is where we get Book 4, where we get all these Adonai Malach Psalms that Joelle was kind of drawing our attention to, where the Lord is King, the Lord is King, the Lord is King. And so those are a couple things, just picking up on aspects Joelle and Melissa already raised.
Yeah, this is really good. I'm especially grateful for the call to hold on to tension. And maybe Melissa, as you said, to bring the tension into our worship space, because we don't usually like to do that. We don't usually like to have a whole lot of tensions in our worship space. But as I'm listening to you all, I am, of course, I understand why the creators of the lectionary gave us just this little sliver of a psalm, but the fullness of the psalm tells a better story. It tells a story about power and dominion gone wrong, particularly as that power and dominion was not subject to God's will and God's desire for how power should be used in the world. And as we think about this as Christians, and as we recognize as for Christians, we recognize the coming of our King into the world, and yet what we see of Jesus as King is Jesus doesn't use power the way that the other kings of the world use power. And so to have this psalm that gives us kind of this complete rise and fall of power, and put that in context of Jesus, who uses power so completely differently than the kings of the world, what a much richer Advent conversation that would be, lectionary writers. So I am grateful to you all for bringing that complexity into this conversation, because I think it's really what is needed and required for us to think about where creation is in this passage. So thank you all for this really rich and not easy, not neat, not clean, but pretty rich conversation. Thank you all for this.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Sprocket Wagner, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and help us spread the word with a good review. And leave us a comment to let us know how you've used the show and how we can make it more useful for your ministry. You can learn more about this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound. Within these pages, there's always new life to be found.